History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5, The Making of the European Age. Chapter 5, World History's New Shape. The material consequences of Europe's new involvement with the world are much easier to measure than some of the others. European diet remains one of the most varied in the world, and this came about in the early modern age. The coming of tobacco, coffee, tea, and sugar alone brought about a revolution in taste, habit, and housekeeping. The potato was to change the lives of many countries by sustaining much larger populations than its predecessors. Scores of drugs were added to the European pharmacopoeia, mainly from Asia. Beyond such material effects, it is harder to proceed. The interplay of new knowledge of the world with European mentality is especially hard to pin down. Minds were changing as the great increase in the numbers of books about discoveries and voyages in both East and the West had shown as early in the 16th century. Oriental studies may be said to have been founded as a science in the 17th century, although Europeans only began to show the impact of knowledge of the anthropologies of other people towards its close. Such developments were intensified in the unrolling of their effects by the fact that they took place in an age of printing too. And this makes the novelty of interest in the world outside Europe hard to evaluate. By the early 18th century, though, there were signs of an important intellectual impact at the deep level. Idyllic descriptions of savages who lived moral lives without the help of Christianity provoked reflection. An English philosopher, John Locke, used the evidence of other continents to show that humans did not share any God given innate ideas. In particular, an idealized and sentimentalized picture of China furnished examples for speculation on the relativity of social institutions, while the penetration of Chinese literature revealed a chronology whose length made nonsense of traditional calculations of the date of the flood described in the Bible as the second beginning of all men. As its products became more easily available, China also provoked in Europe an 18th century craze for Oriental styles in furniture, porcelain, and dress. As an artistic and intellectual influence, this has remained more obvious than the deeper perspective given to the observation of European life by an awareness of different civilizations with different standards elsewhere. But while such comparisons may have had some disquieting aspects, revealing that Europe had perhaps less to be proud of in its attitude to other religions than China. There were still others suggested by exploits, such as those of the conquistadors, which fed Europeans' notions of their superiority. The impact of Europe on world is no easier to encapsulate in a few simple formula than that of the world upon Europe, but it is in some of its manifestations at least at times more dramatically obvious. It is an appalling fact that almost nowhere in the world can most of those in non European countries be shown to have benefited materially from the first phase of Europe's expansion. Far from it, many of them suffered terribly. Yet, this was not always something for which blame attaches to the Europeans, unless they should be blamed for being there at all. In an age with no knowledge of infectious disease beyond the most elementary, the devastating impact of smallpox or other diseases brought from Europe to the Americas could not have been anticipated, but it was disastrous. It has been calculated that the population of Mexico fell by three quarters in the 16th century. That of some Caribbean islands was wiped out altogether. Such facts as the ruthless exploitation of those who survived, on the other hand, whose labor was so much more valuable after this demographic collapse, are a different matter. Here is expressed that leitmotif of subjection and domination which runs through well nigh every instance of Europe's early impact on the rest of the world. Different colonial environments and different European traditions present little but, but gradations of oppressions and exploitation. Not all colonial societies were based on the same extremes of brutality and horror, but all were tainted. The wealth of the United Provinces and its magnificent 17th century civilization were fed by roots which, at least in the Spice Islands and Indonesia, lay in bloody ground. Long before expansion in North America went west of the Alleghenies, the brief good relations of the first English settlers of Virginia with the Red Indian had soared and extermination and eviction had begun. Though the populations of Spanish America had been in some measure protected by the state from the worst abuses of the encomienda system, they had for the most part been reduced to peonage, while determined efforts were made from the highest motives to destroy their culture. In South Africa, the fate of the Hottentot, and in Australia, that of the Aborigine, would repeat the lesson that European culture could devastate those whom it touched unless they had the protection of old and advanced civilizations such as those of India or China. Even in those great countries, much damage would be done, nor would they be able to resist the European once he decided to bring sufficient force to bear. But it was the settled colonies that showed more clearly the pattern of domination. The prosperity of many of them long depended on African slave trade, whose economic importance has already been touched upon. Since the 18th century, it has obsessed critics who have seen it in the most brutal example of inhumanity of man to man, whether that of white to black, of European to non European, or of capitalist to laborer. It has properly dominated much of the historiography of Europe's expansion and American civilization, for it was a major fact in both. Less usefully, it has, because of its importance in shaping so much of the New World, diverted attention from other forms of slavery at other times, or even alternative fates to slavery, such as the extermination, intentional or unintentional, which overtook other peoples. Outlets in the New World, settler colonies dominated the direction of the slave trade until its abolition in the 19th century. First in the Caribbean islands and then on the American mainland, north and south, the slavers found their most reliable customers. The Portuguese, who had first dominated the trade, were soon elbowed out of the Caribbean by the Dutch and then by Elizabeth I's sea dogs. But Portuguese captains turned to importing slaves to Brazil instead as the 16th century went on. Early in the 17th century, the Dutch founded their West Indies Company to ensure a regular supply of slaves to the West Indies. But by 1700, their lead had been overtaken by French and English slavers who had established posts on the slave coast of Africa. Altogether, their efforts sent between 9 and 10 millions of black slaves to the Western Hemisphere, 80% of them after 1700. The 18th century saw the greatest prosperity of trade. Some 6 million slaves were shipped then. European ports like Bristol and Nantes built a new age of commercial wealth on slavery. New lands were opened as black slave labor made it possible to work them. Larger scale production of new crops brought, in turn, great changes in European demand, manufacturing, and trading patterns. Racially, too, we still live with the results. What has disappeared and can now never be measured is the human misery involved, not merely in physical hardship. A black might live only a few years on a West Indian plantation, even if he survived the horrible conditions of the voyage. But in the psychological and emotional tragedies of this huge migration, historians still debate whether slavery civilized blacks in the Americas by bringing them into contact willy nilly with higher civilizations or whether it retarded them in quasi infantile dependence. The question seems as insoluble as the degree of cruelty involved is incalculable. On the one hand, is the evidence of fetters and the whipping block. On the other, the reflection that these were commonplaces of European life too, and that a priori self interest should have promoted the planters to care for their investment. That it did not always do so. Slave rebellions showed revolt, though, was infrequent except in Brazil, a fact which also bears consideration. It is unlikely that the debate will end. Estimates of the almost unrecorded damage done in Africa are even harder to arrive at, for the evidence is even more subject to conjecture. The obvious demographic loss may, some have hazarded, be balanced against the introduction to Africa of new foodstuffs from America. Conceivably, such byproducts of a European contact determined by the hunt for slaves actually led to population growth, but the hypothesis can hardly be weighed against the equally immeasurable effects of imported disease. It is notable that the African slave trade for a long time awoke no misgivings such as those which had been shown by the Spanish churchmen in defense of the American Indians, and the arguments with which some Christians actually resisted any restriction of this traffic still retain a certain gruesome fascination. Feelings of responsibility and guilt began to be shared widely only in the 18th century and mainly in France and England. One expression of it was the British use of a dependency acquired in 1787. Sierra Leone, it was adopted by the philanthropists as a refugee for African slaves freed in England. Given a favorable political and economic conjuncture, the current of public feeling educated by humanitarian thought would be in the next century destroy the slave trade and in the European world slavery. But that is part of a different story. In the unfolding of European world power, slavery was a huge social and economic fact. It was to become a great mythical one, too, symbolizing at its harshest the triumph of force and cupidity over humanity. Sadly, it was also only the outstanding expression of a general dominance by force of advanced societies over weaker ones. Some Europeans recognized this, but nonetheless believed that any evil was outweighed by what they offered to the rest of the world, above all, by the bringing of Christianity. It was a bull of Paul III, the Pope, who summoned the Council of Trent, which proclaimed that the Indians are truly men and are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but according to our information, they desire exceedingly to receive it. Such optimism was not merely an expression of the Counter Reformation spirit, for the missionary impulse had been there from the start in the Spanish and Portuguese possessions. Jesuit missionary work began in Goa in 1542 and radiated from there all over the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, and even reached Japan. Like the other Catholic powers, the French too emphasized missionary work even in areas where France was not herself economically or politically involved. A new vigor was nonetheless given to missionary enterprise in the 16th and 17th centuries and may be acknowledged as one invigorating effect of the Counter Reformation. Formally, at least, Roman Christianity took in more converts and greater tracts of territory in the 16th century than in any earlier. What this really meant is harder to assess, but what little protection the Native American had was provided by the Roman Catholic Church, whose theologians kept alive, however dimly at times, the only notion of trusteeship towards subject peoples which existed in early imperial theory. Protestantism lagged far behind in concern about the natives of settlement colonies, as it did in missionary work. The Dutch hardly did anything, and the English American colonists not only failed to convert but actually enslaved some of their Native American neighbors. The origins of the great Anglo Saxon overseas missionary movements are not to be detected until the end of the 17th century. Furthermore, even in the gift of the gospel to the world, when it came there lay a tragic ambiguity. It too was a European export of enormously corrosive potential, challenging and undermining traditional structures and ideas, threatening social authority, legal and moral institutions, family and marriage patterns. The missionaries, often in spite of themselves, became instruments of the process of domination and subjugation, which runs through the story of Europe's intercourse with the rest of the globe. Perhaps there was nothing Europeans brought with them which would not in the end turn out to be a threat, or at least double edged. The food plants which the Portuguese carried from America to Africa in the 16th century, cassava, sweet potato, maize, may have improved African diet, but it has been argued may also have provoked population growth which led to social disruption and upheaval. Plants taken to the Americas, on the other hand, founded new industries which then created a demand for slaves. Coffee and sugar were commodities of this sort. Further north, wheat growing by British settlers did not require slaves, but intensified the demand for land and added the pressures driving the colonists into the ancestral hunting grounds of the Indians, whom they ruthlessly pushed out of the way. The lives of generations unborn, when such transplants were first made, were to be shaped by them, and a longer perspective than one confined by 1800 is helpful here. Wheat was, after all, ultimately to make the Western Hemisphere the granary of European cities. In the 20th century, even Russia and Asian countries drew on it. A still flourishing wine industry was implanted by the Spanish in the Madeiras and America as early as the 16th century. When bananas were established in Jamaica, coffee in Java, and tea in Ceylon, the groundwork was laid of much future politics. All such changes, moreover, were in the 19th century complicated by variations in demand. As industrialization increased the demand for old staples such as cotton and sometimes created new ones. It was a consequence of this that rubber was to be successfully transplanted from South America to Malaya and Indochina, a change fraught with great strategic significance for the future. The scope of such implication for the future in the early centuries of European hegemony will appear sufficiently in what follows. Here, it is only important to note one more, often repeated characteristic of this pattern, its unplanned, casual nature. It was the amalgam of many individual decisions by comparatively few men. Even their most innocent innovations could have explosive consequences. It is worth recalling that it was the importation of a couple of dozen rabbits in 1859 which led to the devastation of much of the rural Australia by millions of them within a few decades. Similarly, but on a smaller scale, Bermuda was to be plagued with English toads. Conscious animal importations, though, were even more important. The first response to the Australian rabbit scourge was to send for English stoats and weasels. A better answer had to wait for myxomatosis. Almost the entire menagerie of European domesticated animals was settled in the Americas by 1800. The most important were cattle and horses. Between them, they would revolutionize the life of the Plains Indians. Later, after the coming of refrigerated ships, they were to make South America a great meat exporter, just as the Australias was to be made one by the introduction of sheep the English had themselves imported originally from Spain. And of course, the Europeans brought human blood stock too, like the British in America. The Dutch for a long time did not encourage the mixing of races. Yet, in Latin America, Goa, and Portuguese Africa, the effects were profound. So, in an entirely different and negative way, were they in British North America, where racial intermarriage was not significant and the near exact coincidence of color and legally servile status bequeathed an enormous legacy of political, economic, social, and cultural problems to the future. The creation of large colonial populations shaped the future map, but also presented problems of government. The British colonies nearly always had some form of representative institutions which reflected parliamentary tradition and practice, while France, Portugal, and Spain all followed a straightforward authoritarian and monarchical institutional system. None of them envisaged any sort of independence for their colonies, nor any need to safeguard their interests against those of the mother country, whether these were conceived as paramount or complementary. This would, in the end, cause trouble, and by 1763, there were signs, at least in the British North American colonies, that it might be on lines reminiscent of 17th century England's struggles between Crown and Parliament. And in their struggles with other nations, even when their governments were not formally at war with them, the colonists always showed a lively sense of their own interests. Even when Dutch and English were formally allied against France, their sailors and traders would fight one another beyond the line. Problems of imperial government in the 18th century were, though, largely a matter of the Western Hemisphere. That was where the settlers had gone. Elsewhere in the world, in 1800, even in India, trade still mattered more than possession, and many important areas had still to feel the full impact of Europe. As late as 1789, the East India Company was sending only 21 ships in a year to Canton. The Dutch were allowed two a year to Japan. Central Asia was at that date still only approachable by the long land routes used in the days of Genghis Khan, and the Russians were still far from exercising effective influence over the hinterland. Africa was protected by climate and disease. Discovery and exploration still had to complete that continent's map before European hegemony could become a reality. In the Pacific and South Seas, things were moving faster. The voyage of Dampier, a Somerset man, in 1699 had begun the integration of Australia's an unknown continent within established geography, though it took another century to complete. In the north, the existence of Bering Straits had been demonstrated by 1730. The voyages of Bougainvillea and Cook in the 1760s and 1770s added Tahiti, Samoa, Eastern Australia, Hawaii, and New Zealand to the last new world to be opened. Cook even penetrated the Antarctic Circle. In 1788, the first cargo of convicts, 717 of them, was landed in New South Wales. British judges were calling into existence a new penal world to redress the balance of the old, since the American colonies were now unavailable for dumping English undesirables and were, incidentally, founding another new nation. More important still, a few years later, the first sheep arrived, and so was founded the industry to ensure that nation's future. Along with animals, adventurers, and ne'er do wells, there came to the South Pacific also the gospel. In 1797, the first missionaries arrived in Tahiti. With them, the blessings of European civilization may be reckoned at last to have appeared, at least in embryonic form, in every part of the habitable world.